And I want to make a special announcement because right before this meeting, I was watching a video that was just put online by the Civil War Roundtable Congress. They are attempting to do a series of YouTube videos to replace in-person meetings or to supplement them. And their setup is actually pretty good. I was just watching the cost they were offering on the actual military impact of Nathan Bedford Forrest and its activities during the Civil War. The speaker was a tad biased as far as which side he was on, but he was actually very informative, and their setup was actually quite good. So we'll be putting information about these videos next into calls and into emails coming preserving on a YouTube channel rather than just a one and done series of lectures. So they're leaving them up online for a while, which is actually a good step. So we'll be sending out the information on that. And for those of you who were listening a couple of minutes ago, we probably cannot go back to in-person meetings till the end of this calendar year. For those of you who haven't been following, the city of Pasadena has been recommending no major gatherings. Even the Rose Parade has been canceled for this coming January. Smaller meeting groups may be able to meet by the start of next calendar year. I'm hoping we will fall in that category, but it very much depends on how things go. The upholstery work on the auditorium, however, is progressing. So by the time we can move back into there, we will have the new seats with proper cushioning and proper upholstery. So that's the good part. By the time we move back in, the upholstery work will be done and we'll have the 1920 seats with 2020 seating. So at that point, I will hand it over to Michael to announce our speaker for this evening.
Michael, I had to mute you because we're getting feedback from yours. So if you could just unmute so when you make your introduction, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, welcome to everybody. We're happy to have everybody here on this online presentation for the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable. We're very fortunate to have with us this evening Eric Wittenberg as our speaker, who's graciously agreed to stay up late for him in order to give us this presentation. We truly appreciate his time and effort in sharing the insights that he's gained from his new book, Seceding from Secession, which is published by Savas Beatty. And I've been asked by Ted Savas to give a little plug for independent book publishers like Savas Beatty, because it's a challenging economic world out there today, and book publishers like Savas Beatty can use all the support you can get. And in exchange, Savas Beatty is offering a 25% discount on Eric's book. For anyone that is listening to this, all you have to do is go to savasbeatty.com. That's SAVASBEATIE, or you can Google it. And the discount code is virtual, VIRTUAL, and you will get a 25% discount. And I'm sure after hearing Eric speak, you'll want to take advantage of that opportunity. Now, Eric is
for purchasing. Oh, I see. Okay.
That's not me, David.
I'm trying to find him.
Okay. Eric is a practicing lawyer in Columbus, Ohio, but I've assured him that we would not hold that against him. He graduated from the University of Pittsburgh Law School, and he did his undergraduate at Dickinson College. Now, another graduate of Dickinson College was the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, the author of the justly maligned Dred Scott decision.
And
now,
so I think that was the worst president this country's ever had, James Buchanan. Well, quite a combination, those two.
Another thing that many people don't know, though, is that Eric has been especially commissioned by Dickinson College to make amends for Roger Taney. And as a consequence, Eric has become a prolific writer of many Civil War books. and they are all recommended to you. So you can just Google Eric's name and find the many books, although tonight we will be focusing on his most recent one. Often when we have professors come speak to us, I look to the website known as Rate My Professor to find interesting little tidbits about the professors. Well, Eric is not a professor, so I looked him up on Rate My PhD. And to my shock, I found that he didn't have a PhD.
No, I do not.
I alerted the publisher, Savas Beatty, to this, and Ted Savas alerted me that he was totally unaware of that, and that this would, of course, affect any future publishing decisions he might make, because as everyone knows, if you don't have a PhD, you're really not supposed to author books, okay? Now, let me just say that's an inside baseball joke, because we know there is an author who actually believes that you must have a PhD or you can't write good books. So, little inside joke there. Now, what listeners will find this evening is that although there's no PhD after Eric's name, you'll find that he lets his work speak for himself. So please give a warm welcome to Eric Wittenberg. Eric, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. That's quite an introduction. I appreciate it very much. Just a quick note that another particularly prominent alum of Dickinson College, some of you may have known, was my dear friend and mentor, Brian Pohanka. So that was something Brian and I had very much in common. Welcome to my library, friends. It is 10:23 p.m. here in Ohio. This is, I believe this is the latest I've ever been asked to start a talk. So this should be an interesting evening. I do want to note, I've seen a couple of names I recognize, and one in particular I want to call to your attention. Among the crowd here this evening is my friend Dr. John Willen. John is a retired epidemiologist who has been providing daily updates on the COVID-19 situation to his many friends on Facebook, and John is also an extremely knowledgeable student of the American Civil War, whom I know through my capacity as the program coordinator for the Chambersburg Civil War Seminar. So John, you're in Washington, D.C., so you're on East Coast time just like I am, so thank you for staying up late and coming this evening. I was pleased to see your name among those present. Thank you for having me, everybody.
Only for you, Eric. Only for you.
Thanks. So let me get started here. Let me begin by saying that I am not the sole author of this particular project. I had two co-authors with me. One is my friend Edmund A. Sargas Jr., who was until December 31st the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District, Ohio. Ed stepped down as Chief Judge and continues to be a District Court Judge. And his permanent law clerk, Penny Barrick, also joined us in the collaboration that produced this book. So I want to be sure that I'm not claiming sole credit for this. This was very much a team effort, but here I am and here we go. In the years prior to the American Civil War, the Commonwealth of Virginia had a land mass that was roughly 1/3 larger than what it is today. There were approximately 80 counties in the western and northwestern segment of the state that ended up making up what became West Virginia. But it's important to note that it wasn't just the Civil War that brought about the secession of the northwestern counties of West Virginia and the dismemberment of the Commonwealth. In fact, there were ancient issues that dated back to the earliest days of the Commonwealth of Virginia that had to be addressed. As you can see by looking at this map, the northwestern counties had close proximity to the state of Ohio, to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to the state of Maryland. Wheeling, which ended up being the first capital of West Virginia, is, as the crow flies, 60 miles from Pittsburgh. By contrast, it is 350 miles from Richmond. The people in the northwestern segment were much more closely aligned with the people of the states of Ohio, Maryland, and or Pennsylvania, excuse me. And as you can see from the map, at least with respect to the state of Ohio, the Ohio River was the boundary that divided those counties of what were then Virginia from Ohio. But more importantly, there was a physical barrier, and that physical barrier is the Allegheny Mountain chain, which runs approximately on a diagonal angle. And if you see in the middle of the map where there's a county that's got lines through it that says Highland, it's not far from there that and up through the tip of Maryland there is where the Allegheny Mountains run. Anybody to the east of the Alleghenies typically had a much more level, flat landscape. The economy in that part of Virginia was extremely oriented toward agriculture. Consequently, there was a high slave population. Those slaves did much of that agricultural work. The Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River and the Atlantic Ocean were the primary avenues of commerce. It wasn't the rivers. It was, in fact, the James River, the York River, leading to the ocean. That's why the Tidewater plantation area of the eastern part of the state was so drastically different from what the western part of the state is. The northwestern counties, they were not as well suited to agriculture, very hilly, very rocky, densely wooded in places, definitely not flat terrain that was well suited to raising cash crops. People in the northwestern counties tended to be more merchants, industrial workers, things like that. So the economies were very different. In 1850, when this map was created, there was a constitutional convention in Virginia. And that constitutional convention in Virginia did a number of things, but one of the things that it did was it created a new category of taxation. And that new category of taxation was designed to and oriented to benefit the slaveholders who got a big tax break at the expense of those people who lived in the northwestern counties, who really came to resent being second-class citizens in the Commonwealth. And by the early 1850s, it became obvious that sooner than later there would be a split. The great politician from Massachusetts, Daniel Webster, came and gave a speech in the 1850s and was quoted as saying that he believed that there would soon be a separation and the creation of a new state of West Virginia. So this is not anything that has its immediate roots in the Civil War. This is something that had been brewing for a couple of hundred years. The Civil War was just the catalyst that brought things to be. But the real catalyst was the election of John Letcher as governor in 1860, and who took office in early 1861. Letcher, who was from Lexington, Virginia, was very much an ardent secessionist. Almost immediately upon taking office, he did a number of things. One of the things that he did was to call a convention to be held in Richmond where an ordinance of secession would be introduced and would ultimately be voted upon by the convention. He also began taking steps to align with the states that had already seceded or were in the process of seceding, such as South Carolina. It was obvious what his agenda was. So the secession convention was convened in Richmond in February. Among the delegates included John Tyler, as in Tippecanoe and Tyler II, the 10th President of the United States. John Tyler was an ardent supporter of secessionist, argued for it passionately. But in the early stages of the convention, the people in the northwestern counties were actually making progress in persuading those counties to the eastern part of the state not to secede and to remain loyal to the Union. The northwestern counties tended to have a very strong unionist bent, largely due to their close relationship with Ohio and with Pennsylvania, and less so with Maryland, which was a border state. But despite that fact, the movement towards secession was not succeeding until a particular event occurred. And that particular event was the opening of the war with the shelling of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. And once that happened and Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, that's when the snowball, began rolling down the hill to gain momentum toward the secessionist movement in Virginia. And eventually, a vote was held. The day the vote was held, the last speaker before the vote was held was former Governor Henry Wise, who had been Letcher's immediate predecessor. Wise was the one who was in office during the John Brown insurrection and who oversaw the execution of John Brown when that ultimately occurred. Wise also was an extremely ardent supporter of secession. And at that session in April, he put a gun on the table in front of him and declared that he was ready to use that gun to kill anybody who would stand in the way of Virginia seceding from the Union. And with resounding cheers, the resolution to secede from the Union was put to a vote, and it passed with barely a vote from the northwestern counties, but with overwhelming support from the counties in the east. And as the results of the vote were announced, John Tyler was seen to be sobbing with joy. Now, just because the convention approved the ordinance of secession did not necessarily mean that Virginia was going to leave the Union. All of this had to be approved by a referendum of the voters. And that referendum was scheduled for a few weeks later. In the meantime, the people in the northwestern part of the state were making contingency plans of what to do in the event that this ordinance, secession of ordinance passed, or ordinance of secession passed, excuse me. This is Archibald Campbell. Now, this photo was taken much later in life. In 1861, Arch Campbell was all of 24 years old. He was the editor and publisher of the Wheeling Intelligencer newspaper, Wheeling being the largest city in West Virginia, or what's today West Virginia, and obviously the largest city to the west of the Allegheny Mountains. It was an important place of commerce for a lot of reasons. The National Road went through there, the Ohio River went through there, and as we will see, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad went through there. So it is a critical place. And Campbell was an ardent Unionist, and he used his bully pulpit as the publisher of an influential and widely read newspaper to spread the word about being anti-secession and remaining loyal to the Union. And in large part due to Campbell's efforts and the strong Unionist sentiment in the western part of the state, a movement began that ultimately led to a convention being convened in the city of Wheeling in May of 1861. This is an engraving from Harper's Weekly. The building you see was the United States Customs House in Wheeling. It still stands. It is today called West Virginia Independence Hall, for those of you who have ever had the opportunity to visit the lovely town of Wheeling, West Virginia. The purpose of the convention was to discuss what to do in the event that secession was going to be approved. It was convened with a fellow by the name of Arthur Borman as the president of the convention. Among the earliest advocates for West Virginia statehood was John S. Carlisle, and Carlisle was one of the speakers at the first Wheeling convention. And Carlisle, even as early as those heady days, even before the referendum was held on the ordinance of secession, was calling for the creation of a new state, the secession of the northwestern counties from the Commonwealth of Virginia and creating a new state. Now that's an interesting thing because Carlisle will eventually change his tune, as we will see later. Among other ardent supporters were this man, Waitman T. Willie. Willie also was an early advocate for West Virginia statehood, but it was ultimately determined at the first Wheeling convention that such activity was too early, that it was important to wait and see what was going to happen with the referendum. If the referendum passed, the decision was made to convene a second convention in June after the referendum. If the referendum failed, then obviously Virginia would remain in the Union. There would be no need. So with that, the first Wheeling convention adjourned, and they awaited the results of the referendum. And not surprisingly, the referendum passed with very few votes from the Northwest, but with a heavy percentage of favoring it in the eastern part of the state, and Virginia declared itself for the Confederacy. Now, while everything was going on, while the events were going on when the Richmond Convention was being conducted, and toward the end, in particular at the time that the Ordinance of Secession was put to a vote, Letcher had already arranged for the arsenal at Harper's Ferry to be seized by Virginia forces, and had already agreed to align militarily with the Confederacy. So regardless of whether that Ordinance of Secession passed, John Letcher was bound and determined to make sure that Virginia was aligned with the Confederacy. So in some ways it was a foregone conclusion. But when the referendum passed and Virginia officially seceded, the Second Wheeling Convention was convened in June, and a number of important things were done. First and foremost, and most importantly, the Second Wheeling Convention declared that by virtue of secession, that John Letcher, the senators, and all but one congressman from Virginia were traitors, that they had violated their oaths of office to the United States Constitution, and they were declared to have abandoned their offices, and their offices were declared to be open. They then created what was called the Restored Government of Virginia, which supposedly spoke for the entire Commonwealth. Nobody voted for these people. It was strictly a vote of the delegates to the Second Wheeling Convention. What authority they had was certainly an open question, but this man, Francis Harrison Pierpont of Morgantown, now West Virginia, the home of West Virginia University, was elected by the convention to be the governor of the Restored Government of Virginia. Waitman Willie, John Carlisle were appointed by the convention to be the United States senators for the Restored Government of Virginia. The U.S. Senate had already expelled John Mason and the other senator from Virginia, so these men took their place. This will become an important fact. The other offices, elected offices of the Commonwealth, were also declared to be filled by people appointed by the Second Wheeling Convention. So these people who were now representing this Restored Government of Virginia that was elected by nobody and which had no authority east of the Allegheny Mountains, purported to be the government of all of Virginia, while at the same time Letcher's government is operating in Richmond, purportedly governing the entire state. So we've got a problem on our hands here, friends. In addition to creating the Restored Government of Virginia, the convention also passed an ordinance of secession that the western and northwestern counties of Virginia were going to secede from Virginia because they wanted to remain loyal to the Union. They were going to form a new state. There was a lot of discussion over what it was going to be called. One of the proposals was it be called the state of Kanawha, K-A-N-A-W-H-A, named after the Kanawha River that flows through Charleston. But ultimately, the decision was made that this new state was going to be called West Virginia. Well, all of this stuff had to go to a referendum, and the referendum was ultimately passed. And along the way, John Carlisle, of all people, changed his mind. No longer was John Carlisle a zealous advocate of statehood. One of the reasons why was because he believed that raising the issue of abolition of slavery, which was one of the platform planks for the creation of the state of West Virginia, was going to be problematic. And suddenly Carlisle changed his tune and became a vehement opponent of the whole thing that he had originally been the most zealous advocate of. Despite many calls over a period of many months for his resignation from the Senate, Carlisle categorically and absolutely refused to resign and would throw up roadblocks all along the way. We'll come back to that later. This is John W. Garrett of Baltimore, Ohio. Excuse me, Baltimore, Ohio. There is a town near where I live called Baltimore, Ohio. I'm not sure why I thought of that. Of Baltimore, Maryland. Garrett is a lifelong Marylander. He was a zealous supporter of the Union, and in fact was ultimately given the thanks of the United States government by Abraham Lincoln for the critical role that he played in the repulse of Jubal Early's invasion of the North in 1864. because his telegraph operators all along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad were providing critical intelligence to the government in Washington that enabled it to make preparations to meet the threat by Early's invasion. And it's fair to say that if there wasn't a Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, there would be no state of West Virginia. This is a map of the route of the B&O Railroad. You see it begins in Baltimore. It passes through Cumberland, Maryland, after passing through Harper's Ferry. It then goes on to Wheeling. From Wheeling, it crosses the river into Bellaire, Ohio, goes from Bellaire to Zanesville. From Newark, it passes south of Columbus, goes to Cincinnati, where it ultimately ended, until it was later extended from Cincinnati to Indianapolis and ultimately on to Gary, Indiana, and on into Chicago, Illinois, which became its ultimate end. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, known as the B&O, and we'll call it that for these purposes, was the critical supply line for operations in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington. It brought soldiers, it brought ordnance, it brought supplies. It was absolutely essential to the Union war effort, and without it, the Union war effort was doomed to fail. So keeping that railroad operational became a critical challenge for the United States government, and as a consequence, ultimately, in Martinsburg, West Virginia, a division of 10,000 Union soldiers commanded by a fellow named Brigadier General Benjamin Franklin Kelly was situated that became known as the Railroad Division. And the sole purpose of the Railroad Division was to guard the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The B&O was the subject of many attempts by the Confederates to cut it. There were multiple cavalry raids. There were multiple incursions by Confederate infantry and many, many efforts to cut that railroad. So it took a large investment of resources to protect and guard that railroad and to keep it open. And because of that, parts of Maryland and Virginia in particular that were otherwise favorable to the idea of secession were occupied by Union troops. And most importantly, they were Berkeley and Jefferson counties in what is today the far eastern panhandle of West Virginia. Jefferson County is where Harper's Ferry is. It is also where Halltown is. And then the railroad passed through Harper's Ferry. It cut across Jefferson County. It went to Martinsburg in Berkeley County. And from Martinsburg in Berkeley County, it then went northwest to Wheeling. And you see on the upper left-hand corner of the map, Little North Mountain, and then a valley, and beyond it, you see more mountains. That's the Allegheny Mountains, otherwise known as the Appalachian Mountain Chain. That is the dividing line between eastern and western Virginia. Those two counties, Berkeley and Jefferson, were closely aligned with the east. They were not mountainous for the most part. They were heavily agricultural. They had large slave populations, and the populations of those counties, as a general statement, favored secession. So because they were occupied by Union soldiers, basically beginning shortly after the outbreak of the war, the people of those two counties were not permitted to vote in any of the referenda we're going to talk about. They were just simply deprived of the opportunity to vote because they knew what the vote was going to be. So rather than let the vote be unfavorable, they just were prevented from voting. Keep that in mind, friends, because that also will become an important fact as we continue our story. Eventually, however, a piece of legislation was introduced in Congress to admit the new state after the voters of the northwestern counties approved this idea of seceding. And then there was a second convention called for drafting a constitution for the new state. And there were, as we've already seen, some slaves in West Virginia, and that will become an issue. This is John Bingham, a radical Republican congressman from southeastern Ohio, just across the river from Wheeling. Bingham was one of the leading advocates for the admission of a new state to be created from the dismemberment of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and he helped to shepherd the legislation through the House of Representatives, along with Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, who was the leader of the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives. Now, one of the problems that we have here, and this is where the big constitutional issue arises, under Article 4, Section 3 of the United States Constitution, it is possible to create a new state from an existing one. Both the existing state and the new state have to consent to it. And there was historic precedent for it. It had actually happened several times. Vermont was split off from Massachusetts with the consent of Massachusetts. Maine was split off of Massachusetts with the consent of Massachusetts. Kentucky was split off of Virginia with the consent of Virginia. So there was precedent for this. The problem we have with West Virginia is a big one, because on one hand, you have this alleged government, the restored government of Virginia, who wasn't elected by anybody and really doesn't represent anyone but the northwestern counties of Virginia, on one hand, has given its consent to the dismemberment of the Commonwealth of Virginia, regardless of what the rest of the state, regardless of what John Letcher's government may have had to say about it. On the other hand, Francis Harrison Pierpont, John Carlisle, originally, later Waitman Willey, and many of these other officials were the strong advocates and the leaders of the new state. So you've got Pierpont giving consent to the dismemberment of Virginia, while at the same time leading the effort for secession of the northwestern counties. You don't have to be a constitutional scholar to see the problem here, and it's a big one, and it bothered a lot of people. Thaddeus Stevens, being the realistic sort that he was, took the approach to it that it didn't matter, that the ends justified the means. And by that I mean adding another loyal state to the Union and fanning the flames of unionism in the northwestern counties of Virginia was much more important than any constitutional trivialities that might arise. And that was the approach that he took. And ultimately, the House of Representatives passed the bill. Now, we all know from Civics 101 that there are two houses of Congress, and it meant that once the House passed the bill, it then had to be passed by the Senate. And when it went to the Senate, the bill was immediately tabled, and it was put off until the first week of December of 1862. The bill was passed by the House in the early summer of 62, so it just sat for a number of months. This is Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner, you may recall, was beaten almost to death by Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina on the floor of the Senate in the years prior to the war, in a heated argument that broke out over the question of abolitionism. Sumner recovered. He was one of the leading abolitionists in all of the United States. He was one of the leaders of the radical Republicans in the Senate. And Charles Sumner was bound and determined to prevent the addition of another slave state to the Union. And he would not permit the legislation to be introduced before the Senate unless this question of slavery and abolition was addressed. And this is where the big split with Carlisle takes place. Carlisle didn't believe that the issue of slavery should be addressed, so he opposed the bill and opposed it aggressively and did everything he could to throw up every roadblock imaginable to keep the legislation from being passed. In the meantime, Waitman Willey came up with a compromise, and the compromise was that there would be gradual emancipation. That once the new state was admitted to the Union, any children born of slave parents would be free, and eventually their parents and the existing slaves would be emancipated. That satisfied Sumner, who wasn't thrilled about the idea of there still being slavery, but the fact that there was going to be a state that was going to gradually abolish slavery satisfied him, and the legislation passed in early December of 1862. The bill then was taken to the White House by Senator Orville Browning of Illinois, a Republican friend of Lincoln's, and delivered the bill, and Lincoln was troubled. I think everyone knows that Lincoln was a gifted scholar of the law in his own right, and Lincoln was troubled about the constitutionality of this legislation for precisely the reasons that I've pointed out to you. And because he was concerned, he decided he was going to poll his cabinet. Specifically, he was going to ask his cabinet officers to deliver to him written opinions on 2 questions. And those 2 questions were, is this legislation constitutional? And is admitting this state to the Union expedient? Now, at that time, there should have been 7 members of the cabinet. But one of them, Caleb Smith, the Secretary of the Interior, had recently resigned his post to become a federal district judge in Indianapolis, and the position had not been filled. So there are exactly 6 cabinet members, which means there's no tiebreaker. And how do you think the vote came out, friends? If you're thinking 3-3, you are correct. The 3 who rendered the opinions that they believed that it was constitutional and expedient were the following. Secretary of State William H. Seward. Seward had been one of the principal rivals for Lincoln for the 1860 presidential nomination. He was a power within the Republican Party. Lincoln made him Secretary of State. Seward rendered an opinion it was constitutional and expedient. Joining him, Salmon P. Chase of Cincinnati, Ohio, one of the leaders of the radical Republicans, the Secretary of the Treasury, constantly carping, constantly complaining, constantly threatening to resign if he didn't get his way. Chase also wrote an opinion that he believed that it was constitutional and expedient. The third being Edwin McMaster Stanton of Steubenville, Ohio, just across the river from the northern panhandle of what will be West Virginia. Stanton is a former Attorney General of the United States. It's not well known, but during the last 4 months of the Buchanan administration, after Stanton led the legal dream team that led to the acquittal of Daniel Sickles in his murder trial, Stanton accepted an appointment to be the Attorney General of the United States, served in that capacity for the last 4 months of the administration, and then became the second Secretary of War in the Lincoln administration. Stanton was a great lawyer in his own right. He, of all people, you would have expected to do a detailed analysis, and interestingly enough, his is the shortest of the 6 opinions. Very brief, very concise, came to the conclusion that these events were constitutional and expedient. Opposing, Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General, and most importantly, Edward Bates, the Attorney General of the United States, who had been arguing loudly to everyone who would listen from the minute the legislation was introduced in Congress that it was unconstitutional. So these 6 cabinet officers split 3-3, which prompted a frustrated Abraham Lincoln to say, what purpose do I have a cabinet? So Lincoln had written his own brief, and in it, he was influenced by practical reasons. Arch Campbell, Francis Pierpont, other people in the northwestern counties of Virginia entreated him that if he vetoed the legislation, it would destroy the cause of unionism in the Northwest and it would be crushed. And Lincoln ultimately came to the conclusion that it was more important to not crush the cause of unionism. He came to the conclusion that secession in favor of the Constitution, if there had to be secession at all, was better than secession against the Constitution, referring to the secession of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and found it to be constitutional, found it to be expedient, and on New Year's Eve, 1862, December 31st, he signed the bill. But the legislation had an issue. The legislation had the provision requiring the gradual emancipation of the slaves. The state constitution that had been passed did not include that. So the state constitution that had been drafted now had to be amended to address that. So there had to be a constitutional convention called again in Wheeling. They amended the Constitution, and then it had to pass yet another one of these referenda. So the legislation that Lincoln signed said that if the Constitution was amended and it was approved by referendum, 60 days after the referendum, the new state of West Virginia would join the Union. That referendum was held on April the 20th, 1863. It passed, despite the fact that the people of Berkeley and Jefferson counties didn't vote. And on June 20th, 1863, Arthur I. Borman was sworn in as the first governor of the state of West Virginia. West Virginia began to develop its own infrastructure. It needed to do so. The only thing it had were county courts of common pleas that carried over from the counties in Virginia, and the rest had to be created from whole cloth. In the meantime, Pierpont and the rest of the supposed restored government of Virginia no longer had a place to work in Wheeling, so they packed up their operations and moved to Alexandria, which had been under Union control from day one. And there they ran a competing government to that of John Letcher until the end of the Civil War. And as we all know, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox, and before long, the Confederate government ceased to exist. In the meantime, the Lastly Institute here in West Virginia, which was a school, became the first state capital of West Virginia. This is a photograph of it from the early 1900s, but it didn't look any different, and in fact is still there to this day. And Wheeling served as the first capital of the state of West Virginia till well into the 1880s, when finally it was moved to Charleston. But this is what Richmond looked like at the end of the Civil War. It was in ruins. Suddenly, with the Letcher government now removed by the military authorities, Francis Pierpont found himself the actual governor of all of the Commonwealth of Virginia, supported by the United States military. The problem was that the legislature in the Commonwealth of Virginia was filled with ex-Confederates. And those ex-Confederates were livid about the dismemberment of the state, excuse me, and they were particularly angry with Pierpont for his role in bringing that about. So there was an awful lot of conflict, and Pierpont was desperate to establish his bona fides as governor and to establish himself as a legitimate governor. So he came up with an idea. Here's another brief lesson in constitutional law. As a general rule, the United States Supreme Court is the court of last resort in the United States. It is the court where ultimately things are reviewed on appeal, decisions are made on constitutional issues, or questions of law that are inconsistent among the federal courts of appeal are settled by the U.S. Supreme Court. However, there are also a few instances where the U.S. Supreme Court has what's called original jurisdiction. And one of the things that the U.S. Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over are disputes between states. So there was a lot of questions, of course, about what the Commonwealth of Virginia actually was. It had not yet been readmitted to the Union under the Reconstruction Acts, so there were questions about whether it actually still existed or whether it was simply a militarily occupied territory. But Pierpont decided he was going to try to curry favor with these ex-Confederates and bring a lawsuit in the United States Supreme Court to recover Berkeley and Jefferson counties and have them restored to Virginia on the theory that they had been prohibited from voting in the referenda. So this was a lawsuit that would fall under the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. It would be the finder of fact. It would make the decision, and there is no appeal of those cases. So whatever the Supreme Court decided was a final binding decision. So now the question became, who was going to represent the Commonwealth of Virginia? Well, originally, and while all this is going on, there's of course a lot of drama. Andrew Johnson is an interesting fellow. He represents the only time in American history where a split ticket was elected president and vice president. Lincoln, of course, being a Republican, Andrew Johnson being a Democrat from Tennessee. It was a unity ticket, and when Lincoln was assassinated, he became the president of the United States. And as a Democrat, he was opposed to many of the policies of the radical Republicans, who, with Lincoln dead, had no real check on their power other than Johnson. Johnson incurred their wrath almost immediately by opposing them. So they did everything in their power to punish him, and one of the things that they did there were a couple of vacancies that came about in the U.S. Supreme Court when 2 justices died. They passed legislation to reduce the number of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court from 9 to 7 because it's not prescribed in the Constitution. It's established by Congress. Johnson vetoed the bill and Congress overrode the veto, meaning that it became law. So the Supreme Court shrunk from 9 justices to 7. Johnson wasn't permitted to appoint justices, and certain actions taken by Congress also nullified some cases that were pending that should have been decided by the Supreme Court. So you've got all of this drama going on, and then on top of all of it, Johnson was impeached. He survived the impeachment trial by 1 vote, and it was really a difficult time to be president of the United States because there was this great power struggle, not only between parties, but between the radical Republicans and basically the rest of the country. The radicals were determined to impose their will, which included harsh legislation called the Reconstruction Acts. States weren't permitted to rejoin the Union until they did certain things, one of which was to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments that outlawed slavery. This is Reverdy Johnson, senator from the state of Maryland, a renowned, highly respected constitutional scholar. Reverdy Johnson had, among other things, been argued one of the sides in the Dred Scott case. He had defended Andrew Johnson in the impeachment trial. He had defended some of the Lincoln conspirators. He was well known as one of the great constitutional lawyers in the United States. And Francis Pierpont went to him and asked him to represent Virginia in this lawsuit. And Reverdy Johnson declined and instead agreed to represent West Virginia. He was joined by Charles Faulkner, a former Confederate officer from Martinsburg, West Virginia, who had never taken the oath of loyalty and theoretically wasn't permitted to practice law, except that the legislature of Virginia passed a law that permitted him to regain his law license. So these are the 2 men who will be representing West Virginia. So Pierpont had to go shopping for a lawyer for Virginia, and this is who he found: Benjamin Robbins Curtis of Massachusetts. Benjamin Curtis was an associate justice of the United States Supreme Court at the time of the Dred Scott decision. He wrote a vigorous dissent. He was so thoroughly disgusted by the Dred Scott decision that he resigned from the court and took back up the practice of law and became known as one of the great constitutional scholars. Now, during the introduction, Michael mentioned to you Roger B. Taney, who was from Maryland. He was the author of the Dred Scott decision. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. In October of 1864, Taney passed away, meaning that the Chief Justice slot was open. Lincoln had to find someone to take it. Now, in the spring of '64, Salmon Chase had made another one of his attempts to bully Lincoln by threatening to resign, and instead Lincoln called his bluff and accepted the resignation. And Chase was out of a job and out of the cabinet and was looking to run against Lincoln for president, was looking to create problems. And when Taney died, Lincoln, in one of the most shrewd, brilliant political maneuvers in American history, appointed Salmon P. Chase Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, removing his political rival and putting him into a position of equal authority as Chief Justice. Now, remember, Chase had been an active participant in the events that led to the signing of the legislation by Lincoln and had a significant conflict of interest. Do you think that mattered? Do you think he recused himself? Not a chance, friends. So the lawsuit was filed in the Supreme Court of the Supreme Court of the United States in 1866. At that time, there were 7 justices. Chase was not entirely comfortable with his majority. He wasn't guaranteed the outcome he wanted. So after the case was argued, he basically tabled it. In 1868, Johnson left office. Ulysses Grant was elected president, and immediately the Republican Congress repealed the legislation, restored the number of justices to 9, Grant got to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices almost right away, and the court was restored to 9 members. This is what the court looked like in 1868. David Middleton, the clerk clerk, boy, that's a tongue twister, on the left, and then the justices are seated from left to right in order of seniority. The most senior justice, David Davis, Noah Haynes Swain. Next to him, Robert C. Greer, Justice James M. Wayne. In the middle is Chief Justice Chase, Justice Samuel Nelson, Justice Nathan Clifford, and then the 2 new guys, Justice Samuel F. Miller and Justice Stephen J. Field. And in 1871, with a fully convened court and satisfied with the outcome, Chase ordered the case to be re-argued in 1870. And in 1871, the decision was issued. It was a 6-3 decision, but it wasn't what you think. The 6-3 decision ultimately determined that the legislation was such that even though Virginia had now been restored to the Union, at the time, it was not a state. It didn't have standing to object. And the lawsuit contesting the 2 counties being retained by West Virginia was dismissed by the court for failure to state a claim upon which relief could be granted. In other words, it had no legal basis for proceeding. And with that, the great drama ended. Jefferson County, Berkeley County remained as part of West Virginia and remained part of West Virginia to this day. Now, interestingly enough, in 1910, a second lawsuit was commenced in the U.S. Supreme Court by Virginia against West Virginia. This time it was to allocate certain items of public debt for infrastructure, things that had originally been paid for by Virginia in what is to now then West Virginia, over who should be responsible to pay it for those improvements. And that decision was a 9-0 decision that allocated the public debt. That's not an important issue. What's important is that the decision was authored by Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Supreme Court justice. This photo of him was taken in 1902, so I think we can assume that's pretty much what he looked like in 1910, 1911. And he was a Civil War veteran. Of course, had been an officer in the 20th Massachusetts, the Harvard Regiment, one of the great regiments of the Army of the Potomac. He was battle decorated. He'd been wounded in battle. And he wrote the decision. And what's important about it is that the decision makes it seem like there was never any question from the very beginning about the constitutionality of the admission of the state of West Virginia to the Union. It says so in almost those words. It says it was basically a foregone conclusion. There never really was a dispute. So within 45 years of the end of the Civil War, there was no question about whether or not West Virginia was constitutional, and all of the issues were resolved. But interestingly enough, this issue reared its ugly head earlier this year. There is a Republican state senator from West Virginia named Charles Trump. He is not related. I know that because I've asked him that question. Just happens to be coincidental. Charles Trump was interested enough in these issues and in this story that in the winter, this past winter, he initiated a resolution that was ultimately passed by the West Virginia General Assembly that was inviting Frederick County, Virginia, which was originally supposed to be included in the referenda to vote to join West Virginia, but was left out, never got to vote to secede from the Commonwealth of Virginia and join West Virginia. It passed. So this resolution was presented to the county commissioners in Frederick County, Virginia, who very politely but firmly said, thanks, but no thanks, we're not interested, we're happy right where we are. I only raise that to show you that even today in 2020, this is an issue. I know it's an issue in your state in California. I know there have been talks about the northernmost parts of California seceding from the rest of the state. There's some conversations have taken place about secession, the possibility of secession in Texas. So these issues are alive and well. They remain political footballs to this day. All of it is extremely interesting. But most interesting of all, if you go to Wheeling today, that's the Customs House, which, as you can see, still stands. As I said, it's now called West Virginia Independence Hall. And who's the statue to outside? A man who never held an elected office in the state of West Virginia, but who is commonly known, and you see it right there in the pedestal of the monument, as the father of West Virginia. A man who was removed from office because he was unable to govern Virginia after the war, returned to West Virginia, never held an elected office in the state, but yet he's the one who has the monument outside West Virginia Hall as the father of West Virginia. He embodies the constitutional law issue that underlies all of this. And I find it terribly ironic. I took that photograph this spring, so it's obviously still there. And with that, I'm done. Now, if anybody has questions, I'm happy to entertain them, but I will tell you it's 11:12 my time. It's getting late.
Well, we thank you very much, Eric, and I'm sure if you could hear it, the applause would be loud and extended. And those who are members of the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable will understand my need to point this out, but that is that Oliver Wendell Holmes fought at the Battle of Ball's Bluff, and therefore your entire presentation is connected to Ball's Bluff. So
there you go. I like that.
Well, thank you so very much, and we'll let you get to the dreamland that you so richly deserve. And I tell you, I'm sure I speak for everyone who's listening. We learned a lot, and I'm very intrigued. In fact, I can't wait to get into your book. And again, encourage everyone to go to Savas Beatty and take advantage of the 25% discount by entering the code virtual VIRTUAL, and you will get 25% off of Eric's book, which I'm sure everyone is very interested in reading at this point in time. So again, thank you so much, Eric. We really appreciate it. David Richardson, thank you so much for hosting this. And again, a good night to everyone.
Thank you. And hopefully I'll get to see you this fall, Michael.
Great. I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.